Dear students, guests, and colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank each one of you for joining on third edition of Transylvania Lectures. And I would also like to thank every single person who made this seminar possible. Our main idea and goal is to provide a platform on a monthly basis where we can discuss the different topics and issues that preoccupy the thoughts of the intellectuals of our days. In order to achieve this goal, we invite foreign speakers to share their ideas with us. I'm extremely delighted to present our guest, Mr. Charles Crawford, former UK ambassador to Sarajevo, Belgrade and Warsaw. Now he gives masterclasses to the United Nations and governments on the principles and techniques of diplomatic negotiation, speech writing, and public speaking. The moderator of this conversation will be Dr. János Székely, attorney at law, senior lecturer at Sapientia, Hungarian University of Transylvania. Mr. Crawford, Mr. Székely, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for the floor. Dear participants, today evening's lecture will begin with a short keynote speech by Mr. Crawford, and we'll continue with a conversation with us as the protagonists, let's say, and then we will hold a question and answer session. You can use the app for which you have your cards on your seats to post questions to us, and these questions will be read to Mr. Crawford and to me respectively, so that we can answer them. Thank you, and I would like to hand over the microphone to Mr. Crawford for his keynote speech. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Just as we were all waiting to start, I looked at the title. It's always a good idea to know what the title of your talk is. And it's about post-Cold War Europe. And I was thinking about 2 years ago, my mother died. She was 96. And we cleared out the house. And hidden in the house, right hidden where you'd never know it was there, was a little tin box of all their wedding photographs. And in those days, the photographs were about that size. I mean, really tiny. And I don't know why they hid them. I'd never seen them before. There's my mother in Paris on her honeymoon in 1952. Amazing. But one of the pictures was the surrender of Dönitz. When the Germans surrendered to the Allies, Dönitz and Jodl and whoever the other one was, surrendered at some fort. Some of you probably know these famous pictures. When Germany surrendered in the Second World War. And one of the soldiers there had taken a photograph of the actual surrender and given it to my father. And my father must have been 20 then, driving a lorry around Europe, born in 1924, 21. So this post-Cold War Europe is sort of my life. I was born in 54. So I'm talking about my times and your times as well. This is me. I spent a lot of time as a diplomat in these countries: Yugoslavia, South Africa, Russia, Bosnia, Serbia, and Poland. So I didn't work at the UN, I didn't work at the EU, I didn't work in New York, I was in countries. And you can see all these countries were transition countries of one shape or other. That's what I did. And some diplomats spend most time at headquarters. Some diplomats are 50-50 at headquarters in the field. It turned out for me, I was 28 years in the Foreign Office and 20 years overseas. So I lived in these places. I was here when this happened. Do you remember 93, when the communists tried to overthrow Yeltsin? Our flat was a few blocks away from this. You could hear all the gunfire. Next year, President Yeltsin came to, the Queen came to Moscow and met President Yeltsin in the Kremlin. This was the banquet in the Kremlin. I was sitting about 3 meters away from the Queen when they took this picture, which was nice. And then I went to Sarajevo after the war. While this was going on, they had the war in Bosnia. Yugoslavia broke up. So this is the road in from the airport to Sarajevo. This is what it looked like when I landed in 95. Just a total terrible mess. And people were living in those flats because they had nowhere to go. That was their homes. And I negotiated quite a lot with this gentleman. Some of you know who this is. Momcilo Krajišnik. He was one of the leaders of the Bosnian Serbs, and he's now in prison in The Hague on war crimes charges. So I did all this. And I ended up in Poland when the Kaczynskis were in power. This is on the right is Jarosław Kaczynski, on the left is Lech Kaczynski, and Lech Kaczynski was the one who was killed in the Smolensk air disaster with, and on that plane there were 60 people killed, and I think I knew 32. It's a terrible thing. So one of the things I've only got a few minutes, and we've only got a few minutes, all of us, to think about these things. One of the things I think it's interesting to consider is, in any negotiation, whether it's with your family or with your boss or international negotiation, is who is strong and who is weak? How would you know if you're strong? How would you know if you're weak? Do the other side think you're strong? Do the other side think you're weak? So this is a very sort of big idea for the things we're talking about. One of the ideas is strong today or strong tomorrow. Looking at these things over time. And I like to show this picture because it makes everyone nervous, including me. When I was born in 1954, this was the population of these different countries, right? UK had 50 million, Russia 100 million, Kenya had 9 million, Ghana in Africa had 5 million. They were our colonies. We'd gone there and sort of taken them over 40, 50 years before. 2100, when your children are still alive. The UK will maybe have 75 to 80 million. Russia will maybe have gone up a bit to 115 million. Kenya will have 150 million. And Ghana will have 60 million. Kenya will be bigger than Russia in terms of population. And we know this because of the number of babies running around in Kenya and the number of babies in Russia. These are just facts. These are the UN figures. They might be more or less accurate, but the order of magnitude is clear. And so if you look at this graph here, these are the 3 biggest countries in the world by population in 2100. You see the graph at the bottom? The second line, which goes up and comes down, is China. The top one is India. So in about 2060, which isn't that long, it's 40 years, which is 2,000 weeks, India will have 500 million people more than China. Who's coming up fast? Who's that country coming up fast which is close to catching China when your children are alive? Nigeria. There's going to be a lot of Nigerians and Kenyans in the world. Africa isn't so strong now, but Africa is strong tomorrow. That's what's going to happen. So another idea of strength and weakness is what is your assets? If you're a millionaire, you feel stronger than someone who's poor. You might be strong on one scale, but not so strong on another. An elephant is bigger than a scorpion, but a scorpion might kill an elephant if the scorpion gets in the right place. So scale is important. Technique is important. You may be very, very powerful, but are you a bad negotiator? Are you stupid? And then there's this thing, what I call attitude. Do you want to win? or not? Are you happy to compromise or not? So this idea of strength and weakness is quite subtle. And why do I mention all this? Because when I was growing up, this was going on. These nuclear tests. In 1961, and when I say nuclear tests, these were actual atomic explosions. Hiroshimas, much bigger than Hiroshima, in the Pacific, in the desert in America, in the air, below the ocean. These were atom bombs and hydrogen bombs going off. In 1961, there were 71 nuclear explosions. 1963, 50. 1964, 60. That's one a week. 1962, there was one nuclear explosion every 2 days. They weren't even in the news, because who cared? There was another one. This was an extraordinary time. When you think about it now, it seems weird. There hasn't been a nuclear test in, 40 years? But then they were happening almost every day. This was a different world. And by the time you got to 1986, the Americans had 23, according to the internet, 23,452 nuclear weapons. And the Soviet Union had 39,000 Hiroshimas ready to go. So that 39 had 23, what's that, 40, nearly 65,000 nuclear weapons. And then there's China and Brits and France and everyone else as well. That's a lot, too much. So the Cold War was about this. It was about this thing called MAD. Who knows what MAD is? Mutually assured destruction. What that means in English is we'll both get blown up together. You bomb us, we'll bomb you, and there's a lot of bombing to go round. Mutually assured destruction. That was what the Cold War was about. And because it was like that, it was really dangerous. People were quite careful. You don't want to sort of push it too much in Angola in case it leads to a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis. People, it was sort of, the context was sort of careful somehow. Everyone was quite logical about what they did, more or less. So that was the Cold War. Then the Cold War ends, and you get Big Mac. What's Big Mac? Mutually assured cooperation. We will make you richer if you make us richer. It's a totally different psychological thing. And there's a picture of a Big Mac. And they opened Big Mac in Moscow. I was there in Moscow in '93 when the biggest McDonald's in the world was opened in Moscow. Like 25 places where you could queue up and get these hamburgers. So the Big Mac as a physical hamburger and the Big Mac as an idea. You see the difference between this and this. This is incredibly negative. This is quite nice. We all get fat and rich together. That was the plan. And then we scale back the nuclear weapons. And now there are, a few thousand nuclear weapons in the world. Maybe 9,000, 10,000, instead of 65,000. So a major effort was made to change the psychology of the situation. And then when the Cold War ends in Europe, there are 23 and a half new states, if I've got my maths right. So before, in the Cold War, there's sort of East and West and one or two in the middle. Switzerland, Finland, Yugoslavia. All of a sudden, 23 and a half new countries come along. 15 in the former Soviet Union. Chechnya tries but doesn't make it. Czechoslovakia, 2 more. 6 from former Yugoslavia. I think that adds up to 23. Who's the half? Kosovo. Thank you, Kosovo. These guys. And they tried to break away from Serbia, and I think now about 110 countries have recognized them, something like that. There's about 190 countries in the world. something like 110 has recognized Kosovo. But the ones that haven't are quite big, some of them. China, India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa. And what's happening here? Why are they not happy? Why doesn't everyone recognize Kosovo? And when you're looking at, Ukraine and Russia, one of the points I think Russia makes is that Russia's been cheated by the end of the Cold War. We promised this, and they got something else. So that's the argument. And this, I think, is a good part of that argument. Because one of the rules during the Cold War and after the Cold War was you don't change borders without everyone agreeing. So if Montenegro wants to join the UN and everyone else is happy, fine, Montenegro gets in the UN. But if you try to take Kosovo away from Serbia and Belgrade doesn't like it, you're setting a precedent which a lot of countries find, a dangerous one, because it's NATO chopping bits off. That's what they thought. So this Kosovo thing, I think, I don't want to say it was a mistake, because I don't know if it was a mistake. If 100 countries recognize it, it's quite a good mistake as mistakes go. But what it did was set a precedent against Big Mac. This was the point. And that led to Georgia and Abkhazia and all the rest of it. And so we get to this problem now, the one just up the road. I read an interview when I was trying to learn Polish. I read an interview with Putin in a Polish magazine. This is 2003. And they asked Vladimir Putin, what's your policy, really? And he said, to keep what's ours. That's all. What's wrong with that? To keep what's ours. He doesn't say to keep what's ours within Russia's borders. He just said to keep what's ours. And so now what we're dealing with is the idea of what is ours. Is Transnistria ours? Is Estonia ours? Is Finland ours? Is anywhere the Russian Empire has ever been ours? Is anywhere where there are Russian speakers ours? And is Ukraine ours? These Ukrainians, what are they? They're really Russians. They're ours. So we can take them whenever we want. So this principle is not a Big Mac principle. It's basically saying, I'll have what I want, and I'll choose when I take it. So Ukraine has, it's a sad story, really. At the end of the Cold War, Ukraine's GDP was about the same as Poland's, 80 billion. This is pathetic. It's small change off a major international corporation like Apple. They wouldn't even notice if they lost 80 billion. The whole country worth 80 billion. But of course, if you think about it, Ukraine's population is bigger than Poland's. So in fact, Ukraine was even poorer than Poland at the end of the Cold War. Poland, since then, 30 years, Ukraine has gone up to 164 billion. So it's doubled. This figure's from 2021. Poland has gone to 642 billion. So Poland is 8 times richer. Poland is now one of the top 20 rich countries in the world. Amazing success story. But Ukraine sort of hasn't kept up. So Ukraine is sort of, it's weak. Imagine if Ukraine had kept up with Poland, that would buy a lot of weapons. It would buy a lot of roads, buy a lot of hospitals. But they haven't. So they've been sitting there getting weaker, relatively weaker. And then you get this thought, which I think is how I look at Soviet negotiating. It's the idea that we are tougher than you can imagine. I was in Moscow in '95, and I wrote a speech for our Prime Minister when he came for the ceremony for the end of the Second World War. Yeltsin was there, Clinton was there, Prime Minister was there, President of China was there, Mitterrand, Chancellor Kohl, all these people were there. And I wrote our speech for the Prime Minister. And I looked at the numbers. In the Second World War, we Brits lost 500,000 people. That's much less than the First World War, because most of the Second World War, we were stuck on our little island. The Russians lost something like that in the last 3 days of the war attacking Berlin. just wave after wave after wave of 17-year-olds being blown up. And if they turned round, they were shot. This is amazing. We are tougher than you can imagine. We can take more pain than you can inflict, and whatever you do to us, we'll do worse to you. This is a sort of deep, if you like, Russian psychology of negotiating. It's very powerful, and it's very psychological. It's all about psychological dominance. We decide what's ours. And if you try to stop us, it'll hurt us, but it'll hurt you more. And that's where we are now. So I looked at the numbers for, if you can see the little number at the left, it's 1990. This is when the Cold War ended, 1990. And these are the GDP of the different countries. America was much richer at the end of the Cold War. So you're talking trillions. America had 6 trillion in 1990. China and Russia, very poor. America has now gone up to 20-something trillion dollars. China, look at China shooting up to now, what is that, $15 trillion. But look at Russia. It was sort of bumping along, and then Crimea happens in 2015, and it's sort of down to $1 trillion. This is a record of terrible failure. If Russia had managed to grow anything like China, up to, say, $6 trillion, it could just buy Ukraine. Why fight? Just buy it. But instead, they've messed up because there's too much corruption, too much communism, too much, just no real focus on getting rich. And if you focus on getting rich like Poland did or like China did, you can get very rich quite quickly. 30 years, look at the difference between Poland and Ukraine. So now we've got this, a global food crisis arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the World Bank. I mean, this is going to affect you here as well. Everywhere in the world, you can see the prices now going up in the shops in England. Stuff is disappearing because you can't get things. It's going to be a disaster in the Middle East. Now, if you're Russia, what do you think about this? If you're Putin, rather, you think this is great because it'll distract everyone from what we're doing in Ukraine. Doesn't cost us much. They don't care. The worse, the better. And then one of these oligarchs said this the other day, I don't see a single beneficiary of this insane war. Dear collective West, give Putin a clear exit to save his face and stop the massacre. So he's saying, look, Putin will only back down if you give him a golden bridge to help him back down. But the trouble is, what can we offer him? We can't offer him half of Ukraine. It's not ours to give away. We can't offer him money. He doesn't want money. Because if he wanted money, he'd have got rich. I mean, the country. So this is the problem with this. What is the exit that lets Russia save face? It's not clear that there is one. So the basic issue I want to finish with is this. Are there any rules? Who decides and who enforces the rules of global order? These are the questions. Who said this? Let's see who's smart here. There's bound to be one smart person here. Probably lots of smart people. And the people who know the answer from MCC, keep quiet. Who said this? Bring in anarchy, upset the order, create chaos. The thing about chaos, it's fair. Who said that? You're all laughing here. Who said this? You must know this. It's one of the great sentences of political philosophy of the 21st century, or even the 20th century. Who said this? Guys, who said this? The Joker. But the interesting thing is, why is chaos fair? Because rules are made by people like us. We quite like rules. The lights come on. We turn up on time. But rules stop the strong smashing the weak. It just keeps things under control. And the Cold War and the post-Cold War, Mad and Big Mac, were a world of rules. The risk is we're heading to this guy's world. Look at borders. This will be me tomorrow when I get back to England, standing in these queues trying to get through the airport. This is a world of rules. Here's the joker's world. You've got your rules, we'll go underneath the wall. We'll just turn up, we'll get in a little boat, we'll just go where the hell we want. This is the joker's world. You know, countries can't cope with this. It's very difficult. But you know, who's going to control those 700 million Nigerians if they want to come here? It's a lot of people. One of the ideas in diplomatic negotiating is this: you don't win more at the negotiating table than you already control on the ground. So what that means is, if, say, Russia conquers Donbass and they sit down to negotiate, Russia will never give up Donbass. Why? Because it's got it. Why would it give it up? So if you control things on the ground, that helps you at the negotiating table. And I like to show this example. This was the Vietnam War negotiations in 1974 in Versailles in Paris. So on the right, you've got the North Vietnamese. On the left, you've got the Americans, big chandelier, all this going on. This looks like a diplomatic negotiation. It's not. This was the negotiation. The Americans were bombing North Vietnam while they're talking. And they're saying, you guys sign up this peace treaty, otherwise we'll bomb you to hell. And the North Vietnamese said, fine, пожалуйста, keep going. And who won? The North Vietnamese, because this was the negotiation. They wanted to win control on the ground, and they won it, because they were tougher. They were determined to win, and they won. And that's Ukraine now. Who is determined to win? Who cannot afford to lose? So the war on the ground is the negotiation, and it's extremely dangerous, because who knows if it's going to go to Transnistria tomorrow, Moldova the day after, Poland the day after that, Estonia the day after that. These things could happen. What's stopping them happening? I don't know. I'm, baffled by it myself. The end. Thank you. It's cheerful, isn't it?
Mr. Crawford, thank you for a very interesting, perhaps a bit unsettling presentation. I would like to now ask you to please have a seat. Thank you. So that we may continue this discussion on a more, perhaps, deeper level. And the first question, which I would have, is that you mentioned Transnistria, you mentioned the Baltic. Transnistria has seen some developments in the last 2 days. Do you think that these developments, the as of yet unexplained explosions at the security apparatus headquarters in Tiraspol and an as of yet unexplained explosion at the one of the largest radio stations in Europe, which is located in Transnistria, do you think that these developments are likely to be a foreboding sign of the expansion of the conflict, or are they, as some would state, false flag operations, or something that is insignificant as compared to the magnitude of the conflict?
No, I think they're significant for sure, and they may be a false flag operation, and they may be an attempt to expand the conflict because it's a false flag operation. I mean, I don't know what's going on there. I think when the Cold War ended, this is something it's sort of hard to remember now. And I was in the Foreign Office when the Cold War ended, so I was watching this as a young officer. There was a big choice. The Soviet Union is breaking up. Yugoslavia is breaking up. How do they break up? And the world decided that we would allow the Soviet Union to break up along its republic borders. Why did we do that? So there would be someone controlling the nuclear weapons in these different places. On 1991, when Gorbachev fell, there were nuclear weapons in Belarus, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Russia. And so it made sense to let those places become new countries so someone was responsible. And then over the next few years, the nuclear weapons were all taken back to back to Russia. And all that was fine, except that in one or two places, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, Ossetia, Transnistria, there were one or two local things which didn't quite fit, and they've become these so-called frozen conflicts. So maybe, you know, if you're sitting there in the Kremlin, you may say, look, okay, let's tidy up the map. Whatever it is we want, well, now is the time to take it, because we can take Transnistria. Who's going to stop us? And the answer is no one's really going to stop them. It's just too easy for them to do it. So I wouldn't be surprised if this, you know, horrible problem spreads elsewhere in the former Soviet space. And there's not much we can do about that. But what's really worrying is if it spreads over into our space, you know, the NATO space, the EU space. And that would be, you know, a drastic, horrendous escalation, but I don't think it's impossible. So, I mean, they may be just seeing how they go, pushing here, pushing there, because these are easy wins. Ukraine has turned out to be a disaster. I mean, it's really hard to take over a country that big. Transnistria, it would take a few minutes, really. I mean, it's sort of straightforward.
Well, they already have some presence there.
Yeah, sure, exactly. So I mean, so it's sort of done. But then there's the two things. There's the facts on the ground and whether or not they are recognized. So Crimea is not recognized by the overwhelming mass of countries in the world. They do not think that if you go into Crimea, you're entering Russia. There's a Russian passport to get in. There's a Russian customs office. But as a matter of international law, Crimea is still part of Ukraine, even though Russia has sort of taken it. And this is, I didn't sort of say this, but one of the problems with the Ukraine thing is it's hard to think of an example of a country invading another country and taking its land since the Second World War. Tibet, maybe, but which others? I can't, really can't think of many. There's examples of countries breaking up, there's examples of civil wars, there's lots of conflicts, but there aren't many examples of borders being changed where one country says, thank you very much, I'll have that. So when we, blew up Milosevic, Kosovo didn't become part of the UK or didn't become part of America. We actually wanted Kosovo to be free. When Saddam Hussein abolished Kuwait, everyone around the world, including the Russians, joined in stopping that because that's too much. You can't just abolish another country. Too much. So this Ukraine thing, it's almost as if a member of the Security Council is trying to abolish Ukraine or certainly steal lots of its land. And this is a totally different thing. And once you start doing that, then what about Taiwan or what about wherever? You can pick your examples. There's lots. But you don't want that set of dominoes to start falling over. Transnistria is a bit different because it's already contested. But there was nothing, Luhansk and those places, they voted actually. Some of them voted for independence from Russia. No one said that election was fixed. So it's not a contested area in the way that Nagorno-Karabakh is contested or Transnistria is tested. So if for some reason the Russians want to tidy up the map, a good place to start are some of these contested places, because then they can say, well, they're contested and we're just going to take them. But that is different again from taking Donbass.
You mentioned that one of the members of the Security Council would like to abolish a country. Do you think that this conflict is able to subvert the United Nations like the League of Nations was subverted by Germany in the 1920s and 30s?
Well, the answer is maybe, because you had the League of Nations and that didn't work, so they came up with the United Nations. And I don't know if any of you have read Putin's great analysis of Ukraine. He wrote a big sort of essay a couple of years ago, sort of basically saying, look, Ukraine was invented by Russia. And therefore, if we invented it, we can disinvent it. And he came up with lots and lots and lots of historical examples. I think I'm right in saying in that essay, he didn't, or his paper, he didn't give the argument against very fairly or at all. And one of the things people forget now is that when the United Nations was set up, I think there were 45 countries at the original signing ceremony, something like that, 40, 50 countries. Because many parts of Africa were colonies still. There weren't many countries in the world in 1945 compared to now. Ukraine was one of those countries. Ukraine and Belarus were founding members of the United Nations. The Soviet Union demanded that Ukraine be there as a sort of independent, some sort of organism, separate from Russia. Russia wasn't a member of the UN. The Soviet Union was. Soviet Union plus Ukraine. So Moscow then wanted Ukraine to be separate. And so if you start saying, okay, you can start abolishing countries and the UN can do nothing about it, the whole thing might start to crash. Because what's the point? You know, the Cold War deal relied upon borders being really, really solid. And that's why Kosovo, I think, was a problem, because we fiddled with that for good reasons, but it set a bad precedent. But now the Ukraine precedent is going beyond and beyond and beyond that. And so I think, what can the United Nations do about this? Anything it tries to do, Russia will veto. So it's very dangerous precisely because of this.
Well, Mr. Guterres was present at
Sure.
Moscow, I think, in the last 2 days, actually, and he asked for cooperation with Russia on
Sure.
humanitarian matters.
Yeah.
Now, Russia almost flatly refused that. So, at least on the ground, they refused it by continuing military operations. So, do you think that there's this certainty somehow that the United Nations, which Russia sometimes relied on in the past for at least trying to hinder other Western objectives, that the United Nations has become somehow insignificant to Russia, so they can do without the UN?
Well, I don't know if they can do without the UN, but they may think they'll try to do without the UN. The UN isn't this thing up in the sky. The UN is us. The UN are the countries that make it up. And the UN has the rules it has, which we've all agreed to. And if you then say, okay, we as one of the key members of the UN are going to break the rules, and you can do nothing about it because we'll veto you, that makes the whole thing look ridiculous. Now, there's masses of things the UN does which are great, and we'll carry on anyway. But it's like a building. Look at this building. It's fine. You can break the window. You can knock over the TV. The building will be fine. But if you destroy the foundations, the thing starts to get a bit dangerous. So the very foundation of the UN is this idea that borders can't be changed like this. It's an absolutely fundamental principle. And once that principle is qualified, everything else starts to shake. And I think, we all were pleased, at least I was, when Russia got kicked off this Human Rights Council. That was a major embarrassment to Moscow. Imagine a member of the Security Council being kicked off the Human Rights Council. But that may help them think, actually, we don't need this anymore in our lives. They're going to be rude to us, we'll do worse to them. And off they go.
It wouldn't be without an example, since even Weimar Germany, during the period of the 1920s, attempted somehow to subvert the League of Nations by cooperating with Soviet Russia. There was a tendency, for example, for military exchanges that were otherwise banned. German pilots started flying planes in the Soviet Union before Nazi Germany even came along with Russian help. So may they somehow count on, let's say, states that are, if not more sympathetic, then at least a bit less antagonistic to the Russian cause than others. And perhaps can they count on the fact that Germany or other states that are economically important somehow would advance an agenda that balances out the international outrage with the Russian interests?
Well, maybe, I don't know. There's only so much you can speculate on. But I think normally you could count on all sorts of people to help you. But once you start invading other countries and saying, that's ours, that is a principle which has no limit. And so other countries will be quite nervous about what precedent is being set. Because every country, look at this one, Hungary and Romania, or England and Scotland, or China and Taiwan, or North Korea and South Korea. Hundreds of examples around the world have issues with borders of one shape or form. And they're all sort of holding themselves back from using force to settle those borders. So this Russian precedent makes everyone a bit nervous. But there will be plenty of countries in East and West and South, India is staying out of this pretty much. Why? Not because they want Russia to win, but they're quite happy if the UN loses credibility because they want to be on the Security Council. They say, look, we're going to be the biggest country in the world in 1,800 weeks. Why can't we be on the Security Council? And if you don't want us, fine, we'll just sit here and ignore you. So these are very, very deep questions about national identity and the future of the planet, really. And so I think somewhere like China, China likes getting rich. So if sanctions come in and the world economy starts going down, China will get poorer. So China doesn't really want that. Particularly, there's nothing great for China about the Russian activity in Ukraine, except that it makes the West and Russia weaker together. We're all going to get weaker because of this. We in the West and the Russians. At the end of this, we will be far poorer than we otherwise would have been. And other countries will hope to get richer. But it's hard to say what that means for the UN and so on. I don't think the UN would just collapse like the League of Nations did. But it's going to come under pressure.
I've seen today, actually, on the BBC, a kind of analysis that raised the following question. The West now seems united against Russian aggression. However, what happens if the situation changes? There's been a recent visit by the American Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to Kiev. And the Secretary of Defense said something interesting, that the United States is interested in seeing Russian capacities diminish, and Russia paying a heavy toll for this war, so that Russia's military capacities in the future will also remain reduced by this conflict. And this has led some to speculate that perhaps the United States' objectives in the conflict may differ from other Western allies. And the given offer, I cannot cite his name, but his article appeared today, raised this question of victory conditions, whether if the Ukrainians win, what will actually be a win for the Western allies, or what situation will Western allies evaluate as an actual win? Will they suffice with Russia being chased out of the Ukraine? Will they suffice with a frozen conflict? Or will they desire that Russia be bled out during this conflict, as the American position now seems to imply?
I don't know. The faintest idea. But it's a great question, because in all this, what is the test of success? For Russia, for Ukraine, for America, for us, for Romania, for Hungary. What is the test of success here? Can we imagine what anything like a success would look like? And if we have a test of success, we need a test of failure. Is it absolutely clear what failure would look like? And it will be that different countries have a different view of success and failure because they have different interests. That's normal. If you really need Russian gas, your view of success might be different than if you don't need Russian gas. If you're very close to the conflict and taking in millions of refugees, your test of success will be different from New Zealand, where there just aren't so many refugees. So, there's a certain amount of, opportunism or whatever you want in all this, for sure. Russia will be weaker at the end of this, because instead of growing even badly like they were before, their economy will have gone down. They will be... it's hard to understand this. If you don't grow, you go down. And if you grow, your success gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Compound interest, right? If you fail, your failure gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the gap between where you've ended up and where you could have gone and where everyone else is gets bigger and bigger every year. I ran the numbers years ago for what I call the cost of Milosevic. If Serbia had grown at 2% over 30 years, it would be, up there somewhere. Because of Milosevic, it went right down there. And then they're trying to come back up again. And they can never close that gap for 200 or 300 years. Even if they turn into Korea and get 8% growth for 30, 40 years, it'll be hard to close that gap. Because these gaps get very big very fast. So everyone is going to be worse off because of this. But the issue then is, okay, fine, what would lead it to end? And I have to be honest with you, I don't like the rhetoric coming out of London. It's too we're too much in the Russians' face, I think. It's just too much for me. I want us to start, the world, to start talking about what would be a peaceful resolution which is honourable. What is it the Russians really can claim as a serious problem in all this? And what is it the Ukrainians can claim is a serious, honourable response to that? And we get back to some sort of European way of dealing with these things. But the risk is that once it starts, everyone gets so angry, you can't get from where we are now to there. But I would like a lot more focus on what a successful peace might look like, and that might include getting rid of NATO and having some sort of new formation in Europe, not tomorrow, but over the next 30 years, changing the EU to bring Russia into the EU, to have a looser arrangement. I mean, one of the things we did when the Cold War ended was we kept the EU going and we kept NATO going. We didn't really have a way of engaging with Russia on this. And to be fair, Russia didn't want to be in the EU because Russia didn't want the same voting rights as Luxembourg. And Russia didn't really want to be in NATO because it would always be smaller than America. So it was difficult. But maybe we should be looking at all this again because what we've got now is hopeless and dangerous.
During your career...
Some of these questions at some point.
Yes, I think I will limit myself to one single more question.
Okay.
During your career, you've seen a fair amount of conflict in the former Yugoslavia. And you had the experience of seeing, perhaps face-to-face, people who turned out to be war criminals. Do you think that Putin's crimes are going to be judged and that he is going to stand judgment for these crimes of aggression and genocide once this conflict somehow winds down?
Not really, because, I mean, some of you have heard of the Katyn massacres. This is a big thing if you're in Poland. Katyn was where, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Something like 28,000 Polish officers, fire station managers, teachers, academics, they were the elite of Poland, were captured, taken off into the forests and basically murdered one by one by the Soviet Union. And all this is clear. I mean, it's all documented, there's no doubt about it. One of the greatest war crimes, because you've got all the documents. You've got the document signed by Stalin and Kalinin authorizing these murders. You can see it on Wikipedia. It's just there. I saw it in Moscow, the original document. Even that, the Russians will not accept was a war crime because it's just too awful. Now, imagine if Russia somehow, the Putin regime collapses and you get a completely new regime of people who want to make a new start, maybe. But I just think it's too awful for a big country to accept that. It was difficult for Serbia, good knows. Difficult for Bosnia to have these, senior military commanders put on trial, to hand them over. It's psychologically very hard because it's just so awful. You can't accept that responsibility somehow. You don't want that historical responsibility. For Russia to do it, I think, given what they've done with Katyn, which is clear and 60, 70 years ago now, would they hand over Putin? I guess not, because why would you?
That's a rather disturbing prospect, but indeed, it can't be ruled out. There have been other war crimes that didn't result in prosecution, even in Africa, for example.
Most of them don't, because you've got to have a prosecutor. You've got to have, the Hague Tribunal. It's incredibly expensive to have these lawyers sitting there getting paid €300 an hour for 20 years. It's hundreds of millions of euros to set up these trials and try to do them properly. And even then, some of the judgments are strange and not fair in a way. So, the war crimes are obvious in what's happening in Ukraine. Will an international tribunal be set up, which Russia will cooperate with? I don't think so.
Thank you, sir, for your answers. I've been looking at the app for questions from the audience, and I would like to ask these questions. The first one would be, in your time as a diplomat, have you had a chance to talk to Putin? So what was your impression of him?
No, I never did, because I was the counselor at the embassy in Moscow until 96, and Yeltsin, I think, stepped down in 98 or something. So Putin came along 2 or 3 years after I left. I mean, I've met diplomats who have met him, and of course, in those early days, he was seen as a tough but sort of positive guy. He brought in this flat tax for Russia, which was a major reform. You know, there were a lot of cooperation with Russia went on, but then, you know, by about 2005, it's shifting. So the answer is no. I mean, I'd love to meet him, because I think, or at least I would have loved to meet him when he was, you know, because I think if anyone reads my book on public speaking, the last thing in the book is comparing Putin's speeches with Obama's. And Obama is a fabulous speaker, but he says nothing. Putin isn't a great speaker, but his speeches are sort of rich and subtle and deep in that sort of Russian way. So I think, you know, you could have a very interesting conversation with him about the philosophy of these issues, which would, you know, genuinely be rich. But now I'm just wondering whether he actually still is 100%.
Do Western sanctions actually work? It seems that they only hurt the Russians, but Putin seems to be awfully indifferent to his own people.
Well, the point about sanctions is that everyone gets poorer. It's not just to make Russia poorer, it's that we will get poorer as well. We can't buy Russian oil, we can't buy Russian whatever. We can't see Russian tennis players anymore, you know, chess players. Everyone gets poorer by sanctions. Now, the question is, if they work, what's the test of success of them working? Well, if the test of success is to raise the cost to Russia of these things, yes, they're working. If the test of success is to raise the cost so much that Russia stops, they probably won't work. I was in South Africa. South Africa is not a big country. Massive international sanctions against South Africa. It carried on fine. Because once you set up complex sanctions against South Africa, you create a market for sanctions breaking. And the world is full of people who will help out break sanctions. I think the risk for Russia, and I'm not sure about this, but the risk for Russia is that its economy is much more vulnerable than you think because they haven't got richer, because of Big Mac. They've sort of wasted their Big Mac opportunity. So Aeroflot, if you look at all the fleets of aircraft in the world, Aeroflot has one of the most modern fleets, full of Airbuses and Boeings. The problem is these planes can only fly 2, 3, 4 weeks without a certification. And there are no certifications. So precisely because they had a big modern fleet, they can now no longer fly anywhere in the world. Because no one, Thailand or Singapore or Brazil, wants to have a plane landing, won't be allowed to have a plane landing because of what they've signed if the planes aren't certified. So some of these sanctions really hit very, very hard and specifically. And that means that the costs of this will go up for Russia, for sure. Not they all want to fly everywhere, but you add these things up, the economic cost will be formidable. And you're talking trillions of dollars will be lost to the Russian economy over the next 30 years because of these sanctions. Trillions. Not billions, trillions. But will that make them stop? Maybe not.
Given your experience in the post-Soviet sphere and also in the former Yugoslavia, do you think that Bosnia or the Republika Srpska may become the next hotspot of this conflict?
Not really, but it's on the list. Because I could talk for another 10 hours about Bosnia, but in Bosnia the war stopped, but it didn't end. It's still going on through political maneuvering, everyone blocking everyone, blah, 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 blah. Now you might say, look, Kosovo broke away from Serbia, so why can't Republika Srpska break away from Bosnia? And the answer is precisely because Kosovo is the half. Because Belgrade won't let Kosovo break away, Kosovo can't join the UN, can't do anything. Can't change its borders or anything. It's sort of stuck. And Sarajevo will never agree to Republika Srpska breaking away. So Republika Srpska can say, we are a new country. Literally no one in the world, apart from 1 or 2 strange places, will recognize it. And it's only 1 million people. They need Europe. It would just collapse almost immediately. So I think when you look closely at these little sort of examples, they are actually quite different. They have their own logic, their own dynamic. But, Transnistria goes, Moldova starts to go. The Russians somehow try and cut off the Baltic states. And if enough of these fires start flaring up, people might start taking stupid chances, including down there. So you never know. But at the moment, I'd say it's unlikely.
The next question was actually, do you think that Moldova is going to be affected, that it's going to be targeted, or is it's going to fall, as you said, that it's a possibility that Moldova may even be included in this conflict?
Well, I guess so. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how Russia, I don't know enough about this part of the world to know how Russia looks at Moldova. I mean, Transnistria is already, I think under international law, Transnistria is part of Moldova, isn't it? So it's already involved. So that bit might go. My sort of feeling is that the bits Putin really thinks are ours are the bits where there are Russian speakers. So northern Kazakhstan, that one can go for sure. If he wants it, because it's just so easy to take it. Ukraine is complex because of the identity issues of language and so on. And of course, they're fighting back very hard. I don't think there are many Russian speakers in Moldova to the point where this would be a priority. Georgia is sort of seen as somehow theirs because of, Stalin. So there's different ideas of what's theirs. I would have thought on that list, Moldova is probably not that high, but I don't know, you tell me.
Do you think that the Russian attitude to life, to suffering, their cultural identity, makes this conflict more complicated? Does it affect the negotiations with Russia?
Absolutely. Because of this, what I call this Soviet negotiating idea. We can take more pain than you can inflict. This is a very, it's very specific. And it goes back to when I was in Moscow as a diplomat, the issue of the Russian minorities in the Baltic states came up, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right? And our ambassador in Estonia was saying, look, the Russians are being terrible, they're threatening to turn off the gas and all this stuff. So I had to go into the Russian foreign ministry to say, look, guys. And I remember this is a great, wonderful insight into diplomacy. I went to see this Russian diplomat, and his grandfather had been in the Russian Revolution. And there was a street in Moscow named after him, Udaltsov, because Udaltsov knew Lenin. I mean, he was, really serious sort of revolutionary family. But this diplomat was a great guy. I really liked him. He was very normal, very smart. Everything was fine. So I said to him, look, you Russians seem to be linking energy supplies and human rights for your minorities. And in modern Europe, we don't link these things. Human rights are dealt with by the Council of Europe, and energy supplies are dealt with by this, and, wood supplies are dealt with. We don't link all these things. And he said, Mr. Crawford, nothing is linked, but everything is linked. And that is so smart. And of course, he's right. Nothing is linked. But diplomacy is about when you link things. So do you link Transnistria to this? Do you link Moldova to this? Do you link northern Kazakhstan to this? Do you link language to it? And I said to him, look, everyone in Estonia, every single Estonian has got a friend or a relative who was taken to Siberia. So you've got to understand they're unhappy about all this. And he said, Mr. Crawford, everyone in Moscow knows someone who was taken to Siberia. What's the problem? So this is, how do they put their heads round the monstrosity of Stalinism? It's so difficult. What are they doing now when they go into these villages? They're putting up pictures of Lenin. Statues of Lenin are being re-established in bits of Ukraine. This is insane. Lenin burnt down, 40,000 Russian churches. He was a monster. But all the Russian monsters from the Soviet period are buried in Red Square. Lenin is still there. Imagine if Hitler was in Berlin in a little shrine where you all go and look at Hitler. This is really weird. There's nothing else like it on earth. So I really think these psychological factors are really, really very difficult to deal with because they don't fit into a category of analysis the rest of us have.
You said that negotiations actually take place by facts on the ground. In this case, is there any chance for a ceasefire at a negotiating table? A negotiated ceasefire, I mean?
Well, maybe if Ukraine is prepared to accept the facts on the ground, or indeed if Russia is. You know, if they both just decide this is too horrible, then maybe they would somehow come up with a deal whereby, you know, the status quo is somehow or other authorized and carries on, but Ukraine doesn't accept that borders have changed, and Russia pretends that borders have changed. And you just agree to pretend. One thing you probably don't know, but maybe you do, is that we, the British, we never recognized the annexation by Russia of the Baltic states. So de facto, as a matter of fact, they were part of the Soviet Union. But de jure, as a matter of law, we never accepted that. And what that meant was, at the end of the Cold War, and I was dealing with this personally, at the end of the Cold War, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania popped up again, and they came to us and said, where is our gold that was in the Bank of England? And we said, oh, where is it? Oh, we'll have to try and look for it. And we'd kept their gold for them. We'd put a label on it saying, this belongs to them. It doesn't belong to the USSR. As a matter of law, we kept that issue open for 50 years. And they turned up and said, where's our gold? And we said, here it is. And we gave it back to them. So there are things you can do to play with sort of form and reality in diplomacy, which can go on for decades. Like Northern Cyprus, you know, it's sort of there. It has a life of its own, but it's not recognized by anyone as a separate country. Crimea is part of now Russia for most purposes, but most countries in the world think it's still part of Ukraine. So you could have a compromise a bit like that, which has bits of Ukraine treated that way if the Ukrainians are prepared to accept it. But at the moment, they don't seem to be.
Do you think that from the given country's perspective, is Romania's or Hungary's foreign policy towards the Ukrainian-Russian conflict more successful, or presumably more successful in the long run?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't like to say, because I'm not really an expert on, you'll think I'm ducking the question, and you're right. I don't know enough about the detail of what Hungary and Romania are doing. I mean, Hungary clearly isn't throwing weapons at Ukraine, that's for sure, and I don't know whether Romania is. But there may be ways in which you can help quietly, using intelligence information or other ways. If I were Hungary and Romania, I'd be quite worried about this spreading south, because, how to stop that happening. And when you talk about the long run, are we talking about 5 years or 50 years or 100 years? The long run, when you look at those, is the long run the life of your kids? When does the long run become the short run? My feeling is that countries in Europe will do well to support Ukraine, because otherwise, what's the choice? And I know that there are issues of minorities in Ukraine which are, difficult, certainly for the Hungarian community. But the Poles have got that problem too, and the Poles are piling in there to help Ukraine. When this ends, these minority issues can be sorted out in a principled way. But at the moment, the priority is to stop Russia conquering that country.
You mentioned growth as the one of the factors of which account must be taken during international negotiations. Now, do you think that is it perhaps time to take a new perspective on the notion of growth, not only related to GDP, because it's possible that Russia and its ilk may consider that they can change the perspective of the world on success and maybe create another form of measurement of success other than economic growth.
Well, they may, but I think most of us quite like the idea that one way or the other, we get a bit richer. it's not much fun getting poorer. It's not much fun having worse clothes or worse food or the roof leaks. I mean, growth is simply a metaphor for, it's a metaphor for creativity. And what you're really saying, if you say, well, we're going to have a different vision of growth, is we're going to have a different vision of creativity. But the result of that creativity is that by any normal standards, you will be poorer. Now, I don't think that the Russian model of growth is going to catch on. Having said that, you can imagine a world in which all of a sudden food shortages start to pop up and we go through this COVID thing where everyone starts locking down supplies and having rationing, and then the green lobby say, oh, this is great because no one's flying anymore and we're all, we're not using oil and so on. So you could imagine that we will end up having a different vision of success simply because the facts force it. But I don't think that would be because Russia managed to sell it as an alternative model. It may just happen.
Speaking of green lobby, there's a question that sounds in the following way. How do you reckon subsystemic actors, political parties, companies, NGOs, etc., are having a say in today's international relations order? Are they starting to have some more leverage than governments in diplomatic negotiations, including in this situation?
There's this phrase, which I really hate. I'm a reactionary. So I really hate this phrase, civil society. Well, it's the UN and governments and civil society talking together. What the hell is civil society? I mean, what it is, I'll tell you what it is. It's NGOs who get money from government to tell government how great they are. That's basically what civil society is. The civil society people who get invited to these events are people funded by governments, most of them. Big NGOs who are part of the government space. Very few of them are genuinely independent. That's what that actually is. Now, in this context, this is very, very, very heavy global diplomacy. You're talking war and peace. This isn't a thing for NGOs. NGOs can help a bit. I mean, real NGOs. And Twitter can help, and TikTok can help, and all this stuff can help. But this, of all issues, is going to need grown-up attention. Now, I think having said all that, all of us here, probably everyone in this room has a phone, right? Everyone in this room has a phone. On that little phone, there is more computer technology than there was in the whole project to put a man on the moon. It's unimaginable how much technology we have. And one of the really amazing things about this war is that some guy with a thing this big can blow up a tank. Some guy with a thing a bit bigger than this can shoot down a helicopter. So what we're seeing is that the technology of war is changing very fast because of digitalization. And that means it's becoming, if you like, more democratic. And I don't want to make everyone nervous, but I was looking at this video the other day of, it's like a big box, and you drop it out of a plane. And out of the bottom of the box come a whole load of missiles. And the fact that they are dropping through the air somehow activates them. And they fall out of the box and they sort of go, zoom, and off they go. These missiles can fly something like 300 or 400 kilometers. And they can coordinate as they're flying around. If 2 or 3 of them are shot down, the others keep going. But what it means is you can drop these missiles from a cargo plane. You don't need a military plane to drop them. You can sort of throw them out of a balloon. And off they go. And so this is an amazing thing to defend against. How the hell do you defend against this? And the point is, it's very expensive stuff to get these things to work. So they come through this window, but not that window, 500 miles away. It's very difficult. It's expensive. So very few countries in the world can have this stuff, and the Americans are one of them. So what we're seeing is a real issue, I think, of different generations of warfare being played out just up the road. And one of the forms of warfare is, this. 10,000 migrants walking towards Hungary is one thing. 10,000 migrants with iPhones who can coordinate faster than the police can stop them is a completely different force. So in all this, are NGOs and so on going to become factors? I don't think they'll become factors because they're NGOs, but they'll be part of a wider phenomenon of things getting much harder to control. And you already see this now with Facebook and Twitter and so on. There's a real battle on over how you control these things. Can they be controlled at all? By governments? Or are they somehow a sort of thing out there, like a swarm of flies, which no one can deal with? So that, in that sense, things will get harder to control. But I don't think NGOs, NGOs are too old-fashioned to be part of that in a way. They're just, it's the smallness of all these things which is so, and the speed of them. I went to Windsor Castle a few years back to watch a big parade of, in England there's a ceremony at Windsor Castle which goes back 700 years, and the Queen and Prince Charles and all of them, they're all there. And we walked through to get in there, and there was a metal thing, to check you haven't got a gun. And so you walk in there, and I gave in my gun and all the rest of it. And I thought, but this is stupid. Because if I really want to kill the Queen, I buy a little drone on Amazon, I fly it over the wall, I put a bit of poison on the tip, and it just goes down and kills the Queen. I don't need a machine gun to kill the Queen. I don't need a pistol. I can just send 10 drones the size of this thing flying over the walls. No one will ever see them. How do we deal with distance now in warfare? It's a really, really profound question. Because someone sitting in, Brazil can attack a Russian tank in Luhansk.
On this note, another question that somehow touches upon the idea of chaos is that the other day Lavrov declared that because of this, what he considers a proxy war, the world is closer to the Third World War than ever in the past. What do you think and what do you make of this statement by him?
I think he's right. Why not? What is World War III? And I've written about this on my website if you're interested. I've written articles about this. I've been writing about this for 10 years and no one takes any notice. I said, look, the First World War was a battle of empires, just sort of crunching up against each other. British Empire, French Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, German Empire. All these empires just sort of started fighting. It was almost sort of personal. It was weird. The Second World War was sort of ideological. It was a battle between sort of totalitarianism and sort of everyone else. And then the two totalitarianisms started fighting themselves. So there was a sort of ideological component to the Second World War, which I think, wasn't there in the First World War. It's a different thing. And technology had advanced, so you could do it differently. Maybe the Third World War will just be because rules collapse and everyone just starts to grab whatever they can grab, and World War is no plan. It's just because there isn't any planning. It's just like a load of fires that break out and no one can put them out. So I think Lavrov's right, and the Russians, some of you know this very well. They have a military doctrine called escalate to de-escalate. Have you heard about this? Escalate to de-escalate. And what that means is they say, we will do something absolutely outrageous to get everyone just to calm down. So just say, this afternoon or this evening or tomorrow or next week, Russia drops a tactical nuclear weapon in a field near the Ukraine-Polish border. Be the first nuclear weapon exploded in war since Hiroshima or Nagasaki. That would freak out everyone, including us. What the hell do you do in response to that? Now, maybe everyone would say, okay, Russia, let's talk. And then they'd escalate to de-escalate. This is a thing they have in their military doctrine. Now, if you escalate, but then we escalate, because how do you not respond to this? Then you go zigzag, zigzag, zig, and you really are in a serious world war. So I gave a talk in London. I was on a panel talking about all this stuff with financial risk people about a month ago now. And these are people who look at banks and money and climate and all these risks that come along for big corporations. I mean, they're sort of technicians of risk. And I said to them, look, guys, one of the things you did not worry about when you were coming to this conference was being hit by a rock from outer space. You didn't get off the bus and think, my God, I better be careful. Because it's very, very unlikely that you will be hit by a rock from outer space on the way to this conference. So for most of your professional lives, you have never thought about a nuclear war as an issue. There was all this stuff, but even in the Cold War, it didn't seem that likely. And after the Cold War, absolutely unlikely. I think it's now much more likely than at any time since the Second World War. Maybe this is something we genuinely have to worry about. But then worrying about it doesn't help you work out what to do if it happens. But I think it is genuinely more possible, simply because the Russians may be losing. This may be their only way to try and get it to stop in some way which allows them to claim victory.
Mr. Crawford, thank you for your answers and for your time and for your insight in today's presentation. I would...
Thank you for the questions, everyone. Really good.
I would like to thank the audience, myself, for relevant questions and for a high degree of understanding, by the way, of the entire problem as outlined in the questions. Mr. Crawford, thank you very much, and I would also like to thank the organizers for the event, and if there are any further questions to be addressed, I would like the organizers to signal. Yes, they don't, so this means that I may close the event. Thank you, sir, for your excellent presentation.